Mud, blood, and a little gangrene. It's time for the top 10 messed up things in the life of a World War I soldier. Number 10. Hold the mustard, please. World War I cannot be talked about without talking about the crazy advancements in technology. Seemingly, nations and empires were just itching to try them out on each other. Airplanes, tanks, blimps, machine guns, mostly fairly new and extremely lethal. However, the life of a World War I soldier cannot be talked about without talking about mustard gas or chemical weapons. In 1907, major world players agreed to ban chemical weapons from warfare. So you can understand the confusion by Allied soldiers on the Second Battle of Ypres when over 150 tons of chlorine gas were released. A terrible weapon that would cause trouble breathing, burns, and vomiting. It was so effective that the Allies immediately began working on their own chemical weapons and gas masks to prevent the effects of this supervillain level weapon. I think this quote by World War II General MacArthur sums it up. Whoever said the pen is mightier than the sword obviously never encountered automatic weapons. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Number 9. All quiet on the Western Front. This is kind of obvious, but people die in war. In World War I, a lot of people died, and a lot of these young men and comrades in arms formed bonds with one another, only to have those friends and brothers be killed and taken away from each other. Over 2 million German soldiers would perish in the First World War, which later would have all kinds of disastrous effects on the country, especially with the rise of Evil Mustache Man. France also lost a similar amount of men. Trench warfare was brutal, and I'll get to that shortly. One of my favorite books and movies, actually, All Quiet on the Western Front, depicts a group of young German boys who are in this thing together, all while having a strong anti-war message, or at least questioning the legitimacy of the First World War. Just make sure when you're in the trenches, no one's handing you those fresh new boots. It's an omen. Number 8. 1-star review. It may come as a surprise to some of you, but living in the trenches on the Western Front wasn't a super fun time. We don't recommend it here at Bumblebee. If you're like me, then you love a good hearty meal. Like my mom always said, I'm a meat and potato kind of guy. That's just how it goes. A nice grilled rare steak, roasted garlic potatoes, and a freshly tossed crisp lettuce Caesar salad. Ooh, that sounds amazing. I'm kind of hungry now. And maybe a beer or two to wash it down. Just a classic meal for a classic guy that I really enjoy. Sadly for the boys in the trenches, this could not have been further from reality. Anyone in the military today with our modern technology will tell you how delicious MRE rations are. But for soldiers of the First World War, rations were limited. And as time went on, especially on the German side, where in 1918 rations were whittled down to turnip soup and turnip bread. Ugh. There were still beer rations. However, and if I'm going to be shot at, I still want a little ale to cure what ails me. You know what I'm saying? Go a long way. Number 7. Trench living. I know after a long day of work, most folks like to kick back and relax. A nice warm house, a cold beer, maybe the game's on. You come home to a family that loves you. The life of a soldier in World War I was more of the horrific variety. Basically, you live in a deep hole that stretches for miles and interconnects with tunnels and other trenches. It's freezing cold in the winter, blistering hot in the summer. Rain's right on top of you, and the mud. Oh, the mud is an issue. Bogged down in a muddy hole, wet freezing with other miserable men who are also wet and freezing. Just not a fun time for anyone involved. I love winter and a good rainstorm here and there, but the difference is I get to come out of the cold after a long day making snow angels or jumping in puddles. The impending doom and being soaking wet would damper anyone's mood. Number 6. Disease in a time of plague. While living in a trench for long periods of time may suck, there's other things besides spooky spiked helmeted Germans waiting to kill you. Bullets, bombs, and artillery are lethal, but you had a very high chance of dying from disease. A lot of these trenches became isolated from supply lines for multiple reasons, and sometimes could be a logistical nightmare, meaning supplies were oftentimes difficult to come by. But no amount of supply could fix the disgusting living conditions of the trenches. Soldiers claimed by the war would often just rot, as recovering fallen comrades was made difficult in trench warfare, making diseases very easy to catch. Besides influenza and typhoid, the most common sickness would be trench foot, or gangrene, where really the only thing to treat it is a trip to the medic's hut with a saw blade to amputate your foot, in which is a pain I cannot even begin to imagine. No thank you. You ever seen 127 Hours? It's kind of the same thing. Number 5. Of rats and men. The trenches were a messed up place to be for a human being. Seriously, I can't recommend it to anyone. But for a small rodent creature like a rat, it may as well be Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. As a rat, you had access to food scraps, shelter, and everything a growing rat needs. They breed like crazy and had become commonplace amongst the soldiers and decaying bodies sinking in the hellish mud. The rats grew bigger and bolder, with some cases of rats stealing food right out of soldiers' hands. Sometimes there was so many that soldiers had to essentially hunt them in order to cull the numbers, as there was no system for removing them entirely. On a brighter note though, some soldiers kept them as pets to keep their minds off the impending doom of World War I and trench combat. So you know what, that's kind of cool, little rat friend. I'll call him Ralph. I don't know why. Ralph's a cool name. Number 4, No Man's Land. This is what all the chaos is about. The part most soldiers quivering in their boots fear. Maybe it's better to stay with the rats and corpses than freeze. Most soldiers are waiting for one sound. That means two things. A whistle blowing means you're going over the top, or the enemy is coming to you. Either way, someone is going to have to cross No Man's Land, which is the space between two opposing trenches defended on either side with barbed wire, mines, and machine guns, waiting to cut down the enemy charging at full speed. No Man's Land earns its grim nickname as the bodies that fall out there will stay there and become a part of the battlefield. Rolling artillery barrages were meant to aid soldiers in crossing No Man's Land, but no amount of help, liquid courage, or any other factor could really prepare you for that first leap of faith, climbing over the top and facing the enemy. Number 3, Humanity. While a lot of soldiers met their demise to the new inventions of the war like chemical weapons and improved artillery, trench warfare brought out the worst in humanity. The idea of going over the top was to take the enemy trench. Doing so would move the front line up. A war of inches, if you will. However, you cannot take the enemy trench if the enemy is still there. And that is where the bayonets come in, gentlemen. Horrific as it may be, once you made it into the trenches, the warfare looked more like Stone Age fighting than modern. Swords, knives, rifles in close range, clubs, mallets, and homemade blunt objects, and sometimes fists, were used in an intimate setting of a muddy trench just to kill each other, often being some of the most brutal and intense fighting of the war. Even after all that, taking the trench was difficult, but defending it was more, as oftentimes armies went back and forth trying to break enemy lines in between trenches. No thanks. Number 2, Sharks with frickin' laser beams. Okay, I know the title's a little misleading, but hear me out. Airplanes and aviation had only been invented a few years prior, or at least a modernized version of them. So humans gained the ability to fly, something people of the past could only dream of. So what's the first thing humans do to this amazing revolutionary invention? Can we weaponize this? Yeah, it's kind of messed up to think about, but when we gained the ability to fly, one of the first real uses we used it for was to destroy each other. Airplanes did play a crucial role in World War I, but not just for ace pilots like the Red Baron, but for reconnaissance. At least the tank was designed for military application. Leave it up to us to strap an automatic weapon and bombs to one of the greatest gifts ever given to mankind. And the sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their frickin' heads are the same energy. I think so, at least. Number 1, Merry Christmas. This would honestly confuse me if I was a soldier in World War I. It would make me question a lot of things. Things like, why am I here freezing and dying? And shooting at people I don't really have an issue with. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a truce by the Entente and the Central Powers, more specifically on the Western Front, who climbed out of their trenches to shake hands and share a moment of peace on Christmas. The soldiers, for the most part, got along swimmingly. What's messed up is a few days later, they were back at it again with blowing up and destroying each other. Personally, I don't know how you could do that after sharing a beer with somebody. Just doesn't make any sense. That's gonna wrap it up for me today, guys. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe here at Bumblebee. And if you want to cross No Man's Land with me, check out my social link down in the description. Stay sweet, my little honeybees.